My name is Alice Whitfield, and I'm 22 years old. At my birthday party last Saturday, in my father's house in Shaker Heights, my stepmother, Verna, pointed at the dress I was wearing, a soft blue dress I had pulled out of my closet that morning because it had belonged to my mother before she died. And she said in front of 40 relatives and family friends, "That dress is so cheap, just like its owner." She smiled when she said it. She had a wine glass in her hand. The guests within earshot did the thing guests do when a host humiliates someone at her own party. They looked at the floor, they sipped their drinks. They pretended they hadn't heard. My father, standing near the buffet, watched the moment land on me and did not say a word. He just looked at me and through me, the way he had been looking at me for 16 years. I want you to understand something about that dress before I go any further. It was my mother's. My mother died of cancer when I was 6. The dress had been hanging in my closet for 16 years. It had been hers, and after she was gone, I had quietly moved it from her closet into mine. The night before, they cleaned out her things, and I had kept it. I had grown into it. By the time I was 20, I could wear it. I had been planning, for months, to wear it to my 22nd birthday party at my father's house, because it was the closest I had ever come to bringing my mother to a party of mine. I had told no one. The dress was mine and hers. And when I'd looked in the mirror that morning, I had told my reflection that today was the day I was finally going to wear my mother to a family event. And my stepmother, who had known my mother for 20 years, who had been my mother's best friend before she became her successor, who had sat at every birthday party my mother had ever thrown me before she died, looked at that dress and said it was cheap. I did not cry. I had stopped crying at things Verna said when I was about 10. I reached into my purse, and I took out an old recorder, a small black handheld device that I had been given that very afternoon, an hour before the party, by my mother's old attorney, and I walked over to the speaker system my father had set up for the toasts. I plugged the recorder in. I made sure the volume was where it needed to be. The whole room had stopped talking by then, because nobody knew what I was doing. I pressed play. The first voice that came out of the speakers was my stepmother's, 16 years younger, in a hospice room. Verna's wine glass shattered before the recording got to the end of the first sentence. Before I go any further, if you've ever found out late what really happened in the room where someone you loved died, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need it. And drop your city and the time where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel at night. I'm Alice. This is the story of a mother who hid a recorder under her pillow on the second to last night of her life, the woman she had called her best friend for 20 years, and the 16 years my mother waited for me to grow up so I could hear what really happened that night. To understand the recording, you have to understand my mother. And to understand my mother, you have to understand Verna and what kind of friendship she had been, and what kind of friendship she had really been all along. My mother's name was Constance Whitfield. She grew up in Shaker Heights, the daughter of a teacher and a small business owner, and she had been a quiet, careful, observant girl who grew into a quiet, careful, observant woman. She was, by every account I've ever heard from people who knew her before me, the kind of person who saw what was happening in a room and chose, deliberately, what to do about it. She was not a fighter, she was a thinker. She watched, and she considered. And when she finally did act, she acted with the full force of having thought about it for a long time. I want to give you a picture of her, because if you don't see her clearly, the rest of this story won't land the way it should. She kept lists. Everything she did was on a list. Groceries, books to read, things she wanted to remember about me when I was little. She wrote them in a small leather notebook she carried in her purse. I have one of those notebooks now, found in a box of her things Adelaide had kept, and it is full of entries like Alice said moon for the first time today, pointing at the bedroom window, and Alice insists her bear has a sister who lives behind the bookshelf. She wrote down the things I said as though my 4-year-old observations were the news of the world. She was that kind of mother, quiet, attentive, archiving me. She met Verna in high school. They were 15 years old. They were inseparable from then on, in the way teenage girls are inseparable when they have decided to be a unit. My mother was the quiet one. Verna was the bright one, the loud one, the one who walked into rooms and turned heads. They were a pair. They were friends through college, through their early 20s, through the years when my mother met my father at a charity event Verna had dragged her to, through the engagement, through the wedding, where Verna stood up as maid of honor with a speech that made everyone in the room cry. 20 years of friendship. That is the number I want you to hold on to. 20 years before my mother died, Verna had been her best friend. They knew each other's parents. They had keys to each other's houses. My mother trusted Verna the way you trust someone you have known longer than you have known yourself, which is to say, completely, and without considering that the trust could ever be wrong. I've spent a lot of time in the past 3 weeks trying to understand the specific cruelty of a friendship like that becoming what Verna's became. 20 years of being trusted is not nothing. To have access to someone for 2 decades, to know her marriage, her child, her sicknesses, her hopes, and then, when she is dying, to turn all of that intimate knowledge into the weapon you use against her, is a kind of evil that ordinary villains don't reach. Strangers can hurt you. Strangers can take your husband, your money, your reputation. Strangers can do all of that. But a stranger cannot stand at the foot of your hospice bed and use against you the exact knowledge you gave her in the trust of 20 years of friendship. That requires the friendship. That requires the trust. Verna's affair with my father was a betrayal. What she did in the hospice room was a separate, larger crime. A crime only the closest friend in the world could have committed, because only the closest friend in the world had the right kind of access to a dying woman, to walk through her door without questioning, and to know exactly which child slept on the other side of which wall. I do not know exactly when Verna started sleeping with my father. The recording eventually would tell me one number, that the affair had been going on for 2 years by the time my mother died, which would put its start when I was about 4 years old. But I suspect this is just suspicion based on things I've pieced together over the years. That Verna had wanted my father for much longer than that. Maybe since the wedding, maybe since before. Some friendships, when you take them apart later, turn out to have been a particular kind of waiting room. Verna had been waiting in my mother's life for a long time, and when my father started to be interested, she had been ready. My father is named Carlton Whitfield. He is a lawyer. He runs an estate planning practice in Cleveland, has for 30 years. Wills, trusts, the financial machinery of how families pass on what they have. He is, professionally, in the business of designing how love gets organized after death. I think about that a lot. He spent his career advising other families on how to provide for the people they leave behind, and he could not in his own house do the one thing his career was supposedly about. My father is also handsome and charming when he wants to be, and the kind of man who likes being admired by women who are not his wife. I do not need to dwell on him here. He will, over the course of this story, condemn himself more than I could. My mother got cancer when I was 5. It was the bad kind, pancreatic, advanced when they caught it. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lived for almost 2 years, fighting it longer than anyone had predicted. I remember pieces of those years. I remember her hands, which were always cool. I remember the smell of the hospital. I remember her reading to me at the end of her bed when she was too tired to sit up properly. I remember thinking, even then, that my mother was the calmest person in the world. I did not, of course, remember the other thing that was happening in that period, because I was 5 and 6, and that thing was hidden from me. My father was sleeping with Verna the whole time my mother was dying. Verna was over at our house several days a week, ostensibly to help, to bring food, to sit with my mother. Verna was the friend who would not leave my mother's side. That was the public story. The private story, I would learn later, was that Verna was already half living in our house by the time my mother went into hospice, and she had already begun, in small and careful ways, to act like the future Mrs. Whitfield, picking out drapes, suggesting changes to the kitchen, telling my father which suits to wear to which events. My mother saw it. I am sure she saw it. My mother saw everything. The recording would eventually confirm that. But here is the part that, when I learned it later, broke something in me about what it meant to be a person. My mother had a choice to make when she figured out what was happening, and she made the choice that has shaped every part of my life. She did not confront them, not loudly, not publicly. She did something quieter and more devastating. She started moving things, and my mother had assets that were her own. She had inherited a modest house from her grandmother before she ever met my father. A tutor on a quiet street in University Circle that she had kept in her own name throughout her marriage, rented out to a college professor for years. She had a brokerage account she had built before the wedding, separately. She had the kind of careful premarital wealth that a careful, quiet woman accumulates when she has been raised by a teacher and a small business owner who taught her to save. By the time she got sick, that premarital wealth had grown, slowly, prudently, into something around $1.3 million. Not a fortune, but significant. And my mother, when she figured out about Verna, called an attorney. She did not call my father's firm. She called a woman she had known socially for years, Adelaide Pruitt, a distant cousin on her mother's side, and an estate attorney with her own small practice across town. Adelaide and my mother had had lunch maybe twice a year for 2 decades. They were not close, exactly. They were the kind of cousins who liked each other from a distance. My mother chose Adelaide precisely because she was distant enough to be invisible to my father, close enough to be trusted absolutely. In the months between when my mother figured out about the affair and when she died, my mother and Adelaide built an irrevocable trust. Before it was signed, Constance transferred the University Circle house, the brokerage account, and every dollar of her premarital wealth into it. Those assets no longer depended on whatever Will Carlton later saw. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary. Until I reached 22 and completed a college degree, Adelaide would hold the principal as trustee. I was not meant to receive the trust's accountings or its full terms while I was still a child. Adelaide had a narrow emergency power to pay directly for my health, housing, or education if I was ever unsafe or abandoned. But she had authority over property, not custody. My mother did not just write me into a will. She built me a vault with a time lock, and she gave Adelaide the only key. She also signed a new will dealing only with the small property that had not already gone into the trust. She deposited the executed original with the probate court before hospice, where it would stay out of public view during her lifetime. Carlton did not discover the executed will there. He found an unsigned draft in Adelaide's cover letter in my mother's home office, enough to tell him that she had changed her plans, but not enough to show him where the real assets had gone. She did not tell my father. She did not tell Verna. She did not, as far as I know, tell anyone except Adelaide. And then, as her body started to fail her, she did one more thing. She bought a small handheld recorder at a drugstore, the kind people used to use to dictate letters. She hid it under her pillow, and she kept it there, and she charged it once a week, and she waited. Because my mother knew, with the clear-eyed certainty of a dying woman who had seen everything, that her husband and her best friend were going to come for the will. She had figured out what kind of people they were. She knew that the new will and the new trust would eventually surface, and that when they did, my father and Verna would not be willing to accept what she had built for her child. She knew they would come into her hospice room. She knew they would try to make her sign something different. She did not run from that. She prepared for it. She put a recorder under her pillow. And on the second to last night of her life, my father and Verna walked into her hospice room and tried to do exactly what she had known they would. If you've ever known, before anyone else in the room knew, that someone you loved was being betrayed by the people closest to her, and you were 6 years old and could not understand what you were seeing, tell me below. I think there are more of us than people realize. Children who watch something they would not be able to name until they were grown. I did not at 6 know any of this. I was a child whose mother was dying. The world had narrowed to my mother's hospice room and the small adjacent room they let me sleep in, and the cafeteria 3 floors down, and the nurse who brought me juice boxes. My father was around. Verna was around. They were the adults. I did what the adults told me to do. On the night of the second to last day, I was in the small adjacent room. I had fallen asleep around 8 o'clock because the days were long and a 6-year-old in a hospice cannot stay awake forever. The hospice was a small, private facility on the east side of Cleveland. The nurse on duty that night was a woman named Lurleen Mathis, who had been my mother's palliative care nurse for the last 6 weeks. Lurleen was 57 then, a quiet, competent woman who had become, over those 6 weeks, something more than a nurse to my mother. They had become, in the strange intimacy of dying, friends. Lurleen knew everything. My mother had told her. What happened that night I have pieced together from the recording, from Lurleen's written statement, and from Adelaide, who has filled in the rest of the picture for me over the past 3 weeks. I will tell it the way it happened. Around 9:30 in the evening, my father and Verna came to the hospice. They had been together that day. I know this because Lurleen saw them arrive together in the same car. They told the front desk they needed a private conversation with my mother. Lurleen, who had been sitting with my mother, was asked to step out. She did. She stood in the hallway. She did not, she would later say, like the way they had looked when they came in. They had not looked like a husband and a friend coming to comfort a dying woman. They had looked like two people who had decided something. What happened in that room over the next 10 minutes is what the recording captured. My mother had been waiting. She had her hand under the pillow. She turned the recorder on the moment they walked in. Verna spoke first. She said, and I am quoting from the audio I have now listened to more times than I should, "Constance, we need to talk about the will. We know about the new one. Carlton found the papers in your desk. You can't do this to him." My mother said nothing. Verna kept talking. She moved through the room. She walked over to where, I have learned, the door of the small adjacent room was. The door to where I was asleep. She opened it. She looked at me. Then she closed it very softly, and she turned back to my mother, and she said, "Alice is just on the other side of that door, Constance. She's sleeping. She doesn't have anyone but you. You know that. If something goes wrong here, if you don't sign this thing reversing the will, Carlton and I are going to have a very hard time being the people who have to take care of her. We might decide we can't. The state would have to. Foster care. You know what foster care is like for a little girl who's just lost her mother." The recording catches my mother's breath. A long, shaking, indrawn breath. At 22, I understand what I could not have understood at 6. It was not a legal forecast. My father was still my legal parent. But my mother was dying, exhausted, and the two people she trusted most were telling her that if she resisted, I could become a problem no one wanted to keep. In that room, the threat did what it was designed to do. It made a terrified mother sign. Verna kept going. She said, "Carlton brought a document, just sign it. It rolls back the changes. It puts things the way they were. And then nothing happens to Alice and everything is fine, and you can go to sleep tonight knowing your daughter is safe with the people who love her." My father spoke for the first time then. His voice was, I have come to understand exactly what it has been for the rest of my life. Cold, level, reasonable sounding. He said, "Sign it, Constance, for Alice. Everyone goes home." My mother asked, very quietly, if she could see me before she signed. Just to look at me. Just for a moment. My father said, "No." That single word, "no," on the recording. From the man who had been my father. There was a long silence. And then there was the sound of paper, and the sound of a pen, and the sound of my mother signing the document my father had brought. The document Carlton believed would reverse everything she had spent the previous months building. The document he and Verna believed would hand them back the future they thought they were entitled to. Verna said, "Thank you, Constance." The recording catches their footsteps walking out, the door closing, and then, alone in the room with the recorder still running under her pillow, my mother spoke. Just to herself, just to the recorder, just to me, 16 years in the future, she said, and her voice was hoarse and shaking and absolutely clear. "One day, Alice will know. All of it." That was the last sentence on the recording. A minute later, Lurleen came back into the room. What Lurleen told me 3 weeks ago when I met her for the first time at Adelaide's office is this. She had heard nothing through the door, and the hospice rooms were soundproofed, and she had not been close enough to listen. But when my father and Verna came out, she did not like the look on Verna's face. Verna looked relieved. My father looked composed. They left quickly. They did not say goodbye to my mother. Lurleen went into the room. My mother was lying on her back, very still, with one hand still under the pillow. Lurleen sat down beside her, and my mother, without speaking, reached under the pillow and pulled out the recorder and placed it in Lurleen's hand. And she said in a whisper, "Lurleen, listen to me. This needs to go to my cousin Adelaide tomorrow, before they think to ask about it. There's a letter for Alice in my purse. There's a statement I need you to write about tonight. Adelaide will know what to do." Lurleen, who had been a palliative care nurse for 23 years, did not ask questions. She put the recorder in her uniform pocket. That same night, she wrote a dated statement recording what she had personally observed. Carlton and Verna arriving together, asking for private access to Constance, leaving without saying goodbye, and the condition in which she found my mother afterward. She signed it before her shift ended. My mother died the next afternoon. Lurleen, the day after the funeral, drove across town to Adelaide's office and delivered the recorder, the letter, and her own written statement. Adelaide listened to the recording one time, alone, with the door of her office locked. She has told me that she did not sleep that night. She put everything in a safe in her office, and she made copies, and she filed the copies separately, and she began the long, slow waiting that my mother had asked her to do. For 16 years, Adelaide held the recorder. She watched from across the city as my father married Verna 9 months after my mother died, as I grew up in the house Verna had wanted, as the years passed. My mother had left Adelaide a separate written instruction with the recorder. Do not disclose the trust or the recording to Alice before she was 22 and had finished her education, unless Alice faced immediate physical danger, loss of housing, or abandonment. Constance believed an early confrontation would make me the center of a custody war between adults who had already shown they were willing to use me as leverage. Adelaide later told me it had been the hardest instruction of her professional life. She had authority over the trust property, not over me. She kept the assets protected, kept the evidence intact, and waited for the moment my mother had chosen, the moment I could hear the truth and decide for myself what to do with it. The trust was designed to distribute to me on my 22nd birthday after my degree. The recorder was meant to arrive with it. I want to tell you briefly what those 16 years were like, because they matter for understanding why I went to the party in my mother's dress without telling anyone what I was doing. Verna and my father married when I was 7. The wedding was small. I was the flower girl. I have a photo of myself in that role somewhere, a pale, serious little girl in a white dress holding a basket of petals, walking down the aisle in front of the woman who had threatened to put me in foster care 9 months earlier. I did not, of course, know. I had been told my mother had wanted Verna to take care of me. That had been the story. Your mother loved Verna. Your mother wanted us all to be a family. I was 7. I believed adults. The cruelty was not loud. That is the thing I want people to understand. Verna did not abuse me, in the sense the word usually means. She did not hit me. She did not starve me. She did not lock me in closets. She did something quieter and in some ways harder to name. She made it consistently clear in 1,000 small ways across 1,000 small days that I did not fully belong in the house I lived in. She would call me cheap when I bought something for myself. She would call my mother's family cheap when relatives on that side came up at dinner. She would refer to my mother's house, the one I would later learn was in the trust, the one Adelaide had been quietly renting out and managing for me, as that little place with a small twist of the mouth. The word cheap was her favorite word. She used it the way some people use a thumbtack on a corkboard to pin you to a position she wanted you stuck in. My father did not stop her. That is the other thing I want to make sure you understand. My father, in all 16 years, never once said to Verna, "Don't talk to my daughter that way." He let her. He participated in his own quieter way with his coldness. The long pauses at dinner when I spoke, the way his eye would slide past me when I came home from school, the way he treated me as though I were a house guest who had overstayed. I had spent my childhood trying to figure out what I had done. I had tried being the perfect student. I had tried being quiet. I had tried being loud. I had tried being athletic. I had tried being artsy. Nothing had earned me my father's warmth because, I would learn this last week, my father had never planned to give me warmth. I had been, from the night of my mother's death, the inconvenient child who happened to live in his house. I had been the daughter whose presence reminded him daily of the woman he had betrayed and the night he had stood in a hospice room and said no when she asked to see me one more time. I left for college at 18 with the relief of a person being released. I went to a state school not too far from home. I worked through it the way kids without a lot of family money do. I got my degree this past May. 22 years old. The first person in my generation to graduate from college. My father had paid for none of it. Verna had not come to the graduation. My father had come and sat in the back row and left before the reception, citing work. 2 weeks after graduation, Adelaide called. I finished college in May of this year. I turned 22 on the 1st of July. Adelaide called me the next day. She asked if she could meet me for coffee. She said she had something that had belonged to my mother to give me. I had no idea what was in the box. I went to the coffee shop the following week. Adelaide gave me an envelope first, the letter my mother had written, in her own handwriting, in the last weeks of her life. I read it sitting across from this kind old woman who had been holding my mother's voice for me for 16 years. The letter was short. It said, "Alice, if you are reading this, you are 22, and you have made it through, and I am so proud of you that I cannot say. There is a recording in the box Adelaide is giving you. Listen to it alone, first. It will tell you what happened in the room the night I died. I'm sorry I had to leave you that letter to find, but you are old enough now to know, and you have a choice to make about what to do with the truth. Do whatever you can live with. I love you. I have loved you every day, including the days I have not been here to say so. Mom, I cried in that coffee shop for 40 minutes. Adelaide held my hand. She did not say anything. When I was done, she asked if I wanted to listen to the recording. I said yes. I listened to it once, all the way through, in Adelaide's office with her sitting beside me. I did not cry on the second pass. I just listened very carefully to the voices, my mother's, Verna's, my father's, the pen on the paper, the footsteps. One day, Alice will know. All of it. I sat for a long time after the recording ended. Adelaide waited. She has, in many ways, been the most patient woman I have ever met. Finally, I said, "My birthday party is in 2 days, at my father's house." Adelaide said, "I know." I said, "Bring the box, bring all of it, come to the party." Adelaide nodded. She had, I now realize, been waiting 16 years to be asked. The party was at my father's house, in Shaker Heights, a big colonial my mother had never lived in, a house my father had bought with Verna after the wedding. The whole thing was Verna's. Her taste, her furniture, her caterers, about 40 people, cousins, old family friends, some of my father's law colleagues. The kind of gathering Verna threw to remind herself that she was Mrs. Whitfield now, that the title was hers, that the house was hers, that the family was hers. I had picked out the dress that morning, soft blue, old style, my mother's, from before I was born, a dress she had worn in a photo that used to sit on our piano, a dress I had stared at as a child and quietly hoped, in the way children hope, that I might one day be old enough to wear. I had not told anyone. The plan had been to wear my mother to her own husband's house and to see what happened. Adelaide arrived around 6. She had a small handbag with her, big enough to hold a wooden box. Before the first guests gathered, she took the box out, placed it in my hands, and told me I could keep it in my purse until I decided what I wanted to do. Inside was my mother's recorder. We had agreed Adelaide would simply be present, my guest, an older family friend, and that she would only step in if I gave her a signal. I had told her that morning that I might not act at all. I wanted to feel out the room first, to see whether my father and Verna were going to give me a reason. They gave me one. Verna gave me one specifically about 40 minutes into the party. She had been drinking. Not visibly drunk, but loose. She had been holding court near the buffet, surrounded by the older women who liked to be near her at parties. I had been across the room with two of my younger cousins. I had walked over to the buffet to get a piece of fruit. Verna had turned, and she had taken in my dress, really taken it in, the way she took in everything, with the practiced eye of a woman who had built her social life around noticing what other women were wearing. And her face did a small thing I have seen on her face 1,000 times. Recognition. She knew the dress, she remembered it, and she said, loud enough that the whole circle around her heard, "Oh, Alice, that dress is so cheap, just like its owner." The women around her did the small, uncertain laugh of guests who don't know what to do. One of them looked at me with something like pity. My father, 20 feet away, glanced over. He saw the moment. He registered what Verna had said. He did not move. He did not say anything. He just watched with the cold expression I have grown up watching, and he let her words land on me. I looked at him. I looked at her. I did not say anything at first, and then I looked across the room at Adelaide, who was sitting in a chair by the window, and Adelaide stood up. She walked across the room to me. She did not hurry. She did not look at Verna. She came to where I was standing by the buffet and stopped beside me. I reached into my purse and took out the recorder. Adelaide said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Your mother waited 16 years for today. Whatever you decide, sweetheart, I will stand right here." I looked at the recorder for a long second. Verna, across the small circle of guests, had stopped talking. The whole party had begun, the way parties do when something unusual happens, to go quiet. I walked over to the speaker system my father had set up for the toasts. I pulled out my phone. I connected the recorder to the auxiliary input. I made sure the volume was correct. I did not look at my father. I did not look at Verna. I want to tell you briefly what I was thinking in those 30 seconds while I crossed the room, because the speech I had been rehearsing for 48 hours fell away. The arguments I had been building, the things I wanted to say to my father, the long indictment I had drafted in my head against Verna, all of it went quiet. What I felt walking across that floor with my mother's recorder in my hand and my mother's dress on my body was the strangest calm I have ever felt in my life. I was not nervous. I was not afraid. I felt in a way I had not been able to articulate until that moment, that I was finally not alone in the room. My mother had been with me the entire walk across the floor. She had been with me since the morning, when I had pulled the dress out of the closet. She had been with me since Adelaide had handed me the box. The recorder was warm in my hand because I had been holding it. I had the absurd thought that the warmth was hers. I knew it wasn't. I held the thought anyway, because the thought was true in the way truths sometimes are, even when they're not factual. I said into the room, in a voice that was not loud but was very clear, "Before we go any further with the party, I'd like to share something with everyone. It's a recording my mother left me. She left it 16 years ago. She asked that I share it when I was ready, and I pressed play." The first voice that came out of the speakers was Verna's, 16 years younger, in a hospice room. Constance. We need to talk about the will. We know about the new one. Carlton found out in your desk. You can't do this to him. I was watching Verna when her own voice came out of the speakers. I will remember her face for the rest of my life. It was the face of a woman who recognized her own voice and understood in the first second what she was hearing and what was about to come out of those speakers next. Her face went white. Her hand, which had been holding the wine glass, opened. The glass fell. It hit the marble floor of my father's foyer and shattered into a sound that under any other circumstance would have made everyone turn. But no one in that room was looking at the floor anymore. They were looking at the speakers. The recording continued. Alice is just on the other side of that door, Constance. She's sleeping. She doesn't have anyone but you know that. If something goes wrong here, if you don't sign this thing reversing the will, Carlton and I are going to have a very hard time being the people who have to take care of her. We might decide we can't. The state would have to. Foster care. You know what foster care is like for a little girl who's just lost her mother. The word foster landed in the room the way a gavel lands. A few of the older guests, the ones who had known my mother, turned their heads toward Verna at that single word. Aunt Daphne, sitting by the window, made an audible sound. The cousin I had not seen since childhood put down her drink on the side table next to her, slowly, as though her hands had stopped trusting her. 40 people in a room they had walked into expecting a birthday toast were now learning what kind of dinner their hostess had been hosting for 16 years. I watched my father's face. He had been standing by the buffet. He was, by the second sentence, frozen. By the third, he had gone the color of paper. His mouth opened slightly and stayed open. I have never, in 22 years, seen my father look the way he looked in those 30 seconds. He was the man at the end of a long con who suddenly understands, with absolute clarity, that the room has just figured out who he is. The recording kept going. My father's voice 16 years ago came out of the speakers. Sign it, Constance, for Alice. Everyone goes home. A guest near the door, an older cousin of my mother's I had not seen since I was a child, made a sound. A small, involuntary sound like she had been hit. She put her hand over her mouth. Could I see her before I sign? Just to look at her. Just for a moment. No. The whole room felt that no. I watched my mother's relatives, the older ones, the ones who had known her, Aunt Daphne, my mother's college roommate Hetty, the cousin by the door, and I watched their faces shift. They had attended my mother's funeral. They had believed for 16 years that my mother had died peacefully. They had believed my father had been a grieving husband. They had been around my stepmother. They had not known. And now, in real time, they were learning the shape of what had actually happened in a hospice room on the night my mother gave up the trust she had built for her daughter. Because the alternative was that her daughter would be threatened with foster care by the two people who would soon be her family. Hetty, my mother's college roommate, a woman I had grown up calling Aunt Hetty even though she was no relation, was crying silently. I have known Hetty my whole life. I had never seen her cry. She was 62 years old, sitting on a side chair near the bookshelf, with her hand flat against her chest, like she was trying to hold her heart in place. Aunt Daphne, my mother's actual cousin, had stood up at some point during the recording without my noticing. She was on her feet by the window, her back to Verna. She would not look at Verna for the rest of the night. None of them would. The recording was 30-some seconds long, but the social architecture of my father's house collapsed inside of it, irreversibly, room by room. By the time the audio reached the pen on paper part, Verna had become invisible to every guest who had any blood relationship to my mother. She had ceased for them to be a person in the room. The recording kept going, the pen scratching paper, the signature Verna's. Thank you, Constance. The footsteps walking out, the door closing. And then, after a pause that hung in my father's living room, the way breath holds, my mother's voice, hoarse, shaking, absolutely unmistakably clear. One day, Alice will know all of it. I stopped the recording. I want to tell you what I said next, because I had been rehearsing it for 48 hours, and it came out exactly the way I had wanted it to come out. I turned to the room. I said, "My mother died 16 years ago tomorrow. She knew before she died that my father and Verna were having an affair. She knew they were planning to take everything from me. She built a trust to protect me, in secret with her cousin Adelaide. And on the night before she died, the night you all just heard, they came into her hospice room. And they used me, 6 years old, asleep in the next room, as a weapon to force her to sign a document they believed would undo what she had built. They threatened to put me in foster care if she didn't sign. She signed to protect me. And then she put a recorder she had been hiding under her pillow into her nurse's hand and asked her to keep it from me until I was old enough. I turned to my father. You were cold that night, I said. You were cold the way you have been cold to me for 16 years. I used to think you were grieving. I used to think you couldn't reach me because you were broken about her. I know now you were never grieving. You were just cold. You have always been cold. You were cold to her too. The first cold thing I ever heard you say in your life, you said in that recording. No. When she asked to see me, before she signed. No. That's the word I have been hearing from you my entire life. I just didn't know where it started. I turned to Verna. And you, I said, you were her best friend for 20 years. You stood at her wedding. You held me when I was a baby. And you walked into her hospice room with my father. And you threatened to put me into the system if she didn't hand him back the money she had set aside for me. You called me cheap tonight, in her dress. Cheap like the woman who sewed her life back together in her last 6 months to make sure I would be safe. You don't know what cheap is. Cheap is what you did to her. Cheap is what you've been doing to me every day for 16 years. I picked up the box. I put the recorder back in it. I walked toward the front door. Adelaide fell into step beside me. I stopped at the threshold of my father's house. I turned around one more time. By the way, I said, my mother also had a separate trust that you never knew about. It activated last week. The assets she built before she married you, the house she owned before you, the brokerage account she had since college. all of it. She put it in a separate trust before you knew there was anything to take. So whatever you reversed that night, you reversed a decoy. The real thing has been waiting for me to turn 22. It activated on my birthday. I'm a millionaire as of last Tuesday, Dad. And you have no claim to a single dollar of it. She made sure. I walked out. Adelaide walked out beside me. The party did not follow. If you've ever felt your mother's hand on your back 16 years after she died, guiding you out a door, tell me below. I think that night was the first time I felt her in years. She had been waiting for me at the threshold. I had finally caught up. The aftermath has been 3 weeks, and I will tell you the shape of it briefly, because the long version is still being written. Through a litigation attorney Adelaide introduced me to, I filed a probate court petition to determine the validity of the document my mother signed in the hospice room. We attached the original recorder, Lurlene's dated statement, my mother's letter, Adelaide's chain of custody records, and the trust documents showing what Constance had already moved beyond Carlton's reach. Our lawyer did not promise a result. He said the evidence gave us a strong basis to challenge a document signed under duress, but a court would still decide what weight each piece of evidence carried. The recording matters because Constance was in the room and because the original device, the nurse's statement, and Adelaide's 16-year custody give it a story that can be tested rather than simply asserted. The document Carlton forced her to sign did not revoke the irrevocable trust or pull its assets back into his estate plan. At most, it rewrote the decoy will and the small property outside the trust. That was why he had spent 16 years believing he had won something he had never actually reached. A separate grievance has been submitted to Ohio's disciplinary system about Carlton's conduct as an attorney. No one has promised me disbarment. No one has promised me how the civil claims will end. What I know is that he will have to answer for the recording, for the document, and for the way he used a dying woman's fear of her child being alone. Verna filed for divorce 2 days ago. I do not think she filed because she was ashamed. I think she filed because the story she had built her life around stopped protecting her the moment the recording became public. Shaker Heights is a small community. Word has gotten out about what happened at the party. Some people have stopped taking her calls. Others have simply gone quiet. I do not need to measure every loss she has suffered. I only need to know that she will no longer be able to stand in a room full of people and call my mother cheap. My father has not contacted me. I do not expect him to. I would not answer if he did. I am living with Adelaide for the time being. Just a few months while the case proceeds and while I figure out where I want to settle. She has a guest room with afternoon light, and she makes a pot of tea every morning at 7. And she has spent the last 3 weeks telling me stories about my mother that I have never heard. My mother's college years, my mother's wedding day, where Adelaide stood toward the back of the venue and watched her cousin marry the wrong man and could not have known. My mother's voice on the phone, calling Adelaide 18 years ago, asking if Adelaide would do something for her in confidence. My mother's last visit to Adelaide's office 6 weeks before she died, sitting in the chair across from Adelaide's desk and saying, very calmly, I want her to have a real life. I want her to have what is mine to give her. And I want her to know someday what happened. I trust you with both. Adelaide kept that trust. For 16 years, I cannot describe what it does to a person to discover that the world contains someone who has been holding your mother's promise to you for 16 years, faithfully, without telling anyone, without ever wavering. Adelaide is the kind of person who makes you believe in the slow, patient goodness of the world. I am going to find a way to be that kind of person for someone else eventually, because Adelaide was that person for me. And the only thing you can really do with that kind of gift is pass it forward. I have been learning in the past 3 weeks what my mother was like as a young woman. Adelaide has photographs I have never seen. My mother at 20 in a sun hat on a beach in Michigan. My mother at 26, the day she passed the entrance exam for graduate school. She would never finish because she chose to take a job and help her own mother through a hard period. My mother holding me as a newborn with an expression I have spent the past 3 weeks trying to memorize. Adelaide has been opening a side of my mother to me that I never had access to as a child. The side before the marriage, before Verna's full grip on her life, before the cancer. The young woman my mother was. The funny one. The one who, Adelaide tells me, used to call her up on Sunday mornings just to read out loud the headlines she had found absurd. Constance had a deep love of the absurd, Adelaide said. She just kept it quiet because she had married a man who didn't. I am still learning my own mother at 22, 16 years late. It is the strangest kind of grief to mourn a person you didn't fully know, while finally being introduced to her. Lurleen, the nurse. Lurleen is 73 years old now, and she came over to Adelaide's house last week, and the 3 of us had dinner. She held my hand for a long time when she met me. She had been with my mother in the last hour. She had heard my mother's last words. She had carried that alongside Adelaide for 16 years. She said very simply, "Your mother was the bravest person I ever took care of, and I have taken care of a lot of people." That is what she said. I have written it down so I will not forget it. Lurleen also told me one thing during that dinner that I had not known. She said my mother's last sentence, the one not on the recording, the one she said when Lurleen came back into the room after my father and Verna had left, was not about the recording or the trust or the will. It was about me. My mother had taken Lurleen's hand and she had said, "Tell Alice I am sorry it had to be this way. Tell her I love her. Tell her I will be in her room every night until she is old enough to understand." Lurleen has wanted to pass that message on for 16 years. She has waited until I was sitting at a dinner table across from her, in Adelaide's house, with the recording finally played and the truth finally out, to give me my mother's actual last words. She gave them to me over a bowl of soup. I cried into the soup. Adelaide and Lurleen both pretended, kindly, not to notice. The dress, my mother's dress, the soft blue one Verna called cheap, is hanging back in my closet, where it has been for 16 years. I have decided I will wear it one more time, eventually. When I get married, if I get married, I will wear it at the rehearsal dinner. It is the closest thing I will ever have to my mother walking me down the aisle. Verna will not be there. My father will not be there. But the dress will. And that, I think, is the right shape of the future my mother built for me. People ask me, the few who know the whole story, whether I think my mother would have approved of what I did at that party. And I think about the recording, which I have listened to many times now. I think about her voice in the silence after my father and Verna walked out, alone in a hospice room with nothing left to give, saying into the small machine under her pillow the one sentence she could still control. One day, Alice will know. All of it. She did not say one day Alice will avenge me. She did not say one day Alice will hurt them the way they hurt me. She said Alice will know. She left me a recording, not a weapon. She left me a truth. She trusted me to do with it what I could live with. And what I could live with, in her dress, on the floor of the house Verna had built on her grave, was the truth. Out loud. In front of every relative who had spent 16 years not knowing. With her own voice ending the recording, like she was standing in the room with me, telling me that the silence she had paid for with the last night of her life was finally over. I came home from the party with Adelaide that night. I sat on the guest bed in her house. I held the recorder in my hand for a long time. And then I said into the empty room, the way you talk to someone who isn't there but is. I heard you, Mom. I know now. All of it. I think she heard me. I think she had been waiting for 16 years to hear me say it back. And I think, somewhere, the quiet, careful woman who hid a recorder under her pillow on the second to last night of her life set her hand down and let go.